And the thing with analysis is it can even mean different things to people in the same job, in the same team, sat next to each other. It's that potentially divisive. I'll be honest and start by saying this one is going to make me nervous because this topic is potentially very divisive. The old joke goes, if you have three analysts in the room, you have six opinions. I want to stress that neither Howard or I will make any firm definition as to what analysis is or what it isn't. We're just going to pass comment on what the mainstream interpretations of that word are and how it bled into different schools of thought. Because analysis for me, it's a little bit like dancing. You can have some types of dance that's very structured and highly ordered and highly ritualistic. And you've got other schools of dance that are kind of more casual, more relaxed, but still got a bit of structure there. To free form, do what you like, do what feels natural, and just dance where the spirit takes you. And the same can be said of analysis. If you look at the history of the word analysis, it goes back to an old Greek word meaning to break something apart into its component pieces. The idea being that sometimes you come across things that are so big or complex that the only way to deal with them is to try and disassemble them and kind of take the key bits, to the key parts, try and gain some hidden insight or meaning. And that's kind of held true. But in the English language, it now means analysis can mean so many different things. It can be a very scientific and logical breakdown, like a chemical analysis. It can be something very broad and narrative in structure, as you would see in intelligence analysis. You can have quantitative or qualitative analysis, but I've barely skimmed the surface. This one word analysis does so much heavy lifting because it features in so many careers and means so many different things to different people. And the thing with analysis is it can even mean different things to people in the same job, in the same team, sat next to each other. It's that potentially divisive. So, Howard, I'd like just to introduce you to get your take on what analysis is and know any way you'd like to start, basically.
I think that's a really good intro. And just like Mark would say, I would not say in any way that what I believe or how I perceive analysis is the one right definition. My experience in my life and in my professional career is that, kind of like you alluded to, Mark, sometimes people and organizations like to define something not only so that they can understand it, which is fine, or put it to use and use that understanding as a way to explain their analyst approach to somebody else. That's fine. But there's also an element of trying to control and own analysis. So kind of if you create the definition, by definition, any other interpretation is wrong. And my experience within law enforcement, within the private sector, in all fields of life, including professional life, is everybody has a different take. Like you say, from even the same people in the same organisation doing the same job, they'll have a different perspective based on their outlook on life, their processes, their education, their culture, the organisational culture, so on and so forth. The way I do deal with everything in life, analysis included, is I like to break it down into first principles and then try and rebuild it to see if it ends up being where I thought it was. And it never does with analysis. And if you look at the dictionary definitions, which aren't related to law enforcement or any one profession, it all talks about examining anything complex in order to break it down and try and understand its key features. And you do that examination in detail. And that's what we all do as human beings, whether we're trying to choose which smartphone we buy, where we go on holiday, what kind of meals and clothes we're going to wear, or professionally in whatever our professional setting is. The thing is, the term analysis is just that, it's term. And if you just look at it as a noun, um, the many other words that you could use to describe it, and I'm looking here at just one collection from one of the dictionaries online. So this isn't me, this is just it just shows how cataloguing, classification, codification, enumeration, arrangement, separation, examination, evaluation, deconstructing, diagnosis, tabulation, segmentation, reduction, scrutiny, cataloguing, indexing, subdivision, anatomizing, assessment. But I agree with all of those. You could look at each one of those as a separate factor, but they are all relevant components in the big umbrella that is analysis. So I think that's where you need to start. But then my career's been in law enforcement primarily, and that trains you to be primarily an investigator of criminal information. I don't mean information about crime. It might be information about how human beings are involved in crime, be it as victims, witnesses, criminals, societies, whatever organisation. And if you think about it like that, um, part of the process of analysis within law enforcement is you're actually trying to investigate, in this case, crime and criminal behaviour. But if you were an academic, you would be investigating information from data related to some scientific or other academic field of study. If you're in business, you analyse data and information to develop better business practices and models and be aware of the marketplace and whatever the business objectives of your business. Governments do the same. It's all analysis. And I've always I like to steal. I'm a thief taker. I like to go to places and capture new knowledge and think, is there anything in that I could maybe use in my tasks, in my daily role as a human being, as a professional, or in my workplace role? And that's what gives me a rounded perspective, and it takes me almost to a philosophy of what analysis is. So that kind of doesn't answer the question, but it just shows how, like you say, people all arrive at an understanding of what they think as analysis is or isn't. And I get very tired and frustrated sometimes with people standing on one particular definition, kind of, I'm going to fight for this definition above all. Anything else by definition must be false, because they are deliberately excluding or prioritizing data and information and processes of analysis to control it to be what they want. And that's not what analysis is. Analysis is this basic, simple function of human beings, be it as individuals or as organizations. Does that kind of set the scene?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first big split I think I should talk about, and we will cover each in more detail in separate episodes, but the first big split is between academia and intelligence analysis, right? Because what confused me when I first got started is I went to uni and did information science degree back in the 2000s, and analysis was a very small thing in support of academic research. And usually when you had an analytical example or where you would use analysis, you might be analysing survey results, you might be analysing some sort of quant data. But 9 times out of 10, the analysis basically resulted in the creation of some sort of chart, a line chart, pie chart, whatever. So it's usually kind of quite quantitatively focused. Even if it was qualitative in origin, it was quantitative in outcome. And then when I got into the police, and then suddenly I didn't have any of those traditional data sets. I didn't have surveys. I didn't have things I could precisely measure. I didn't deal with sales or transactions. And I was surrounded with things like crime reports, incident reports, intelligence reports, forensic or scientific reports, lots and lots of narrative, lots of unstructured data or barely structured data. And then at the same time, as I'm being trained, I'm being told that research supports analysis. And that's the first big switch, is that in academia, because we talk about qualitative and quantitative research methods, we talk about qual and quant analysis. Analysis supports research. In intelligence analysis, it's the other way around. And the reason why I think it's important to reflect on that is sometimes to notice that these same words can mean very different things, because in academia, analysis is usually a very focused activity, focused at a singular data set, and has a very usually often statistical approach. Not always, but most of the time. And in intelligence analysis is you're not analyzing a single piece of data, you're analyzing a situation, usually, and it's usually situationally focused. And in some respects, I would say intelligence analysts, but also sometimes academic analysts, we're in the business of opinion formation. And what analysis is, you alluded to with your dictionary example, is lots of different ways you can work with data to change, first of all, your own worldview as the analyst or the investigator, but then the worldview of others, right? Because essentially it's all belief work, it's all opinion work. All of this stuff is to try and extract meaning from the real world so we can say, before we looked, we thought X, we've looked at this thing, we now think Y. And in a intelligence analysis context, that's usually a very broad piece. So you might be thinking, is somebody going to invade, or is in a law enforcement context, is one organized crime group going to be more of a threat than another one? And I think that's the barrier. Is like a dictionary example, like my professional examples, is the same words are being used for many different things, but ultimately it's not to say one is better than the other. It's to recognize that regardless of where you sit in a intelligence analyst chair or a qual and quant analyst chair or any other chair, if you're spending if you are spending a lot of time working with data or information in order to gain more understanding, to change your or other people's worldview, you're dealing in analysis. And I think that's the value of analysis, is trying to recognize that it's a very broad church, it's a very broad word, and there's many different types of analysis you can do.
I agree with that. Um, what always surprised me was law enforcement as a profession, and within that, the intelligence and analysis profession that was developed. And I'm talking globally here because I've had the privilege of working globally and being part of the formative process or the evolution of law enforcement information intelligence and analysis, as well as the training and education and the professional development of the practitioners of these subjects and the products that we would give or they would give to the customers, the law enforcement organisations and the wider public. And some of the law enforcement perspectives, when I first started, they were just as almost didactic as this is what it is. And I learnt those on my journey of, right, I need to start understanding the law enforcement analysis rather than what I might call the scientific model of analysis that I'd picked up in academia as a student in science. And when you actually look at how law enforcement approached it, um, a lot of the training within law enforcement, first of all, was derived from a military history where intelligence had been used throughout the various world wars and more subordinate wars. So kind of like I'm a thief taker, law enforcement had stolen what they thought the best bits of those ideas were to use in law enforcement for their business objective. Nothing wrong with that. Um, but one of the training programs that was developed in the mid to late 80s actually came from a recognition within law enforcement globally that maybe there wasn't a universal standard here. And maybe having one would be a benefit, not only to each organisation in dealing with its own business issues, but this recognition of a problem shared is a problem halved. Maybe there was a need to have a common language and common processes to allow us to talk about the issues of crime and criminality, the tasks of law enforcement, if you will, in a way that the other parties would understand, help us to help each other. And again, nothing wrong with that. It was a noble aspiration. But what happened, it started in America, where um, a private company was tasked in America to actually look at what law enforcement processes were at the time and come up with a structure. And that company was a company called Anacapa Life Sciences, based in Santa Barbara in California. Um, and they were a group of people who would actually do what maybe you call decision tree analysis. I can remember talking to the key players in that very small organization, and they would design the sort of decision process for launching a missile from a submarine or a ship. You know, if you get this information, who tells what and what is the answer? A kind of a yes/no decision tree. And they were given the task by law enforcement. I can't remember which particular law enforcement organisation in the US asked them, but they came up with a model, which they called criminal intelligence analysis, and they created a training course. I was lucky enough to be one of the first in the UK to go and train on that early in my law enforcement career, and worked with that company and the key players in that for many years. Firstly, to take on their methodology, and my task for my organisation was to bring it back and train my force and ultimately the UK and the rest of the world, but also to help them develop it because they weren't law enforcement employees. So whilst some of their perspectives were very good, some of them didn't necessarily match some of the real world problems and situations and tasks and challenges that law enforcement might face. But when they first started their modelling, they created something called an analysis pyramid. Their term, not mine. And it started out with information. Now, semantically, I think that's wrong. It starts with data. Information is something beyond data, and we've discussed that in other episodes. But they talk about how you collect and collate and evaluate data and describe it, which is basically what perhaps you and I would term information. But then they would go into something and say analysis is you start working with that described, evaluated, collated and collected data pot, information, as we would call it now, or I would. And then through intellectual processes, and they would talk about inferences and hypotheses, and nothing wrong with that. You would come up with theories, you would assess them and test them against the data, kind of scientific method or some method, and you'd come up with a product, and the product was intelligence. So basically, analysis was the process you put data that had been turned into information through to get intelligence as the product out of the end. That's not a bad model from a zero-sum start point, but you very quickly realise it's full of a number of flaws. But one of the things I did like about it was it had these stages, and in real life we know these stages on different bits of data might be coming in and being worked at different times. So you might have lots of different separate processes collecting data, collating it, so on and so forth, and then being fed to the analyst to pick up and process. The analysts themselves may well ask for further data collection and collation to better create information products that they could analyse in the task that they were in. But the other thing was, it reflected the reality that the definition of analysis, the generic one of this kind of trying to understand complex information and make it more simple and easier to comprehend and therefore think about, because a pyramid has a very wide base. And the top of the pyramid has a point or a very narrow point. And at every stage, what you're trying to do is actually reduce the volume. So you're kind of going from a quantitative high number, but potentially unknown quality. And at each stage, you're trying to reduce the volume, but increase the quality for the particular purpose, if that kind of makes sense. So it's a more derived product at every level. And I was always a big fan of this intelligence pyramid as a kind of indicator for a process, because in law enforcement at the time, they would train the intelligence cycle. This idea that we've discussed in other episodes about you collect data and then you analyse, you turn it into information, and then you analyse the information and you come up with a product and you go out and act on it, and then you look at the data that comes back about the actions and assess this kind of cyclical process. But a cycle isn't the pyramid. The pyramid gave conceptual models of this stage process of reducing something down from size in quality to something else. But what that started me to think about was, what is the task for analysis? And the first task has to be, what data have we got? Not information, what data is available? Is it the right data, and is it relevant to the problem we're looking at? And testing that is a precursor, because you can analyse the heck out of any pot of data. But if it's not relevant or providing some raw material to process to get to an outcome of value to the problem you look at, you're just spinning your wheels really. You're doing a lot of work for no real progress. And that's something that law enforcement organisations I always found struggled with, because they would say to the analyst, and sometimes for good reason, "Look, this is the only information we've got," or "This is the only data we've got." And the answer to that is, "That's fine. I can work on that. But if you want me to get you a more relevant product in terms of intelligence derived through analysis, if you go and collect me this kind of data from this kind of place, that would allow me to improve my information product and therefore my analysis and my intelligence products." People used to get really hung up on all this, and I found this training it to students globally in my early years involved in this. So I came up with a system, and I said, "Well, look, if you think about crime, the kind of questions that law enforcement organisations ask about crime is, we've got data about crime, tell us who did it." So you've got kind of the bottom of the pyramid, and the top of the pyramid is the whodunit, the sort of the typical detective story. And the other way round was, we're looking at a criminal, or criminals plural, and we want to know what they've been doing. So in effect, you're starting at the top of the pyramid as an organisational task and going down to find out what they're doing, or are they doing it or not. So you're going from the target, the offender, to the crimes, or back the other way from the crimes to the target, up and down that pyramid. And if you think about that, and good analysts ask questions, if you're starting with crime information, the first question is, what changing in the environment, in the data, has created or increased the opportunity for that type of crime to occur? And it may be a new IT tool, it may be a new road network, it may be a new type of crime. But if you can look in data, that may give you a clue. And then out of that pot of information, what crime has occurred that might be grouped, or if you can group it, what are the patterns and common features in which those groupings are made? So there may be many opportunities for crime around the world. There all are, always are. But you think, well, there's some opportunities here for cybercrime, there's opportunities here for human exploitation, there's opportunities here for burglary. The organisational problem is, or societal problem. You can group them in some way. And then the other thing for me is, if the crime is goods orientated, i.e. people are ultimately stealing or acquiring goods to dispose of them and therefore acquire assets, where are those goods being recycled into the public domain? I.e., yes, okay, the crime report might say that somebody came and stole somebody's car at a particular time of day and location. But clearly, a criminal stealing a car, unless they want it for themselves, isn't the end of the criminal activity. The end is when they dispose of it and get another asset, usually money, back. So there may be no pattern in the crime, the theft, but there may be a pattern in the disposal and the financial return. And it's kind of like follow the money, that old adage, which is a pretty good process for looking at human motivation. And then when you look at the two, the crime and the disposal in this kind of goods crime, what are the patterns that link those features? And then what's the organisation behind the pattern? And I don't mean who are the people doing it, but if you were building a business model to carry out that kind of crime, you think, right, well, we need somebody to steal the car, so they need to know about how to steal cars and be able to drive cars. We need somebody to transport that car to somewhere where it can be sold or disposed of. We may need somewhere to store it and alter it on the way. We need somebody who can recruit and identify buyers. And then once we've sold it, we need a way to get the funds back in and pay our costs and share the money. So you can build this model of how they operate, and activity charters might be called back in the day in law enforcement. You don't know who they are, but you can see how they might go about that business. And that allows you again to start looking for the people behind it, because organisations don't commit crime. People commit crime. People who are part of organisations are on their own. So if you've got that kind of organisation, that helps you think about who are the people behind the organisation. And it's all hypothesising, is this? But if you've got the people, right, where are they in the hierarchy? And if I can explain, here am I, Howard. I'm an old man. When I was in law enforcement, I was a middle manager in terms of rank. So I had a position mid in the organisational structure. But I actually, because of my role, had a lot of influence, both on more junior roles, subordinate roles, and higher roles as well. So functionally, I had a lot more clout than, shall we say, the wage I was being paid might have reflected. But take me out of that. In my hobbies, I have a different placing. I may be high on a hierarchy with one thing, lower in another within the profession of analysis. I started out as a member of various professional bodies, and I ended up being one of the senior managers and the direction drivers for probably 2 decades globally. So my position in that hierarchy changed. But I guarantee you, when I came home at night to my family, my position in the family was beneath my wife, beneath my kids, beneath the kid, beneath complete strangers. But I had a different place in different organisations. And knowing that helps you think about not just where are they in these different organisations, i.e. in the crime organisation, but sometimes if they're in crime, they're very well protected if they're quite high up. They have this kind of armour that they build to defend themselves from investigation. But if they're in a different hierarchy where it's not criminality, and everybody is, we're all human beings, we do different things in our life, that different position they're in that hierarchy, if you can identify it, might give you law enforcement an opportunity to, shall we say, investigate and infiltrate where they are more vulnerable. And this is just the kind of tradecraft. And the final bit was a reference to good old scientific method. Okay, we've gone through all this process and we've gone from crime to a target or a potential target. Is there other information that we've got in our data pot that fits this overall theory or doesn't? And does that affect how we process it? So that was my idiot's guide, a simplistic duffer's guide to how to work through the intelligence pyramid. You can do the same the other way around from crime to target. You've got crime. What's the structure behind the crime? What are the patterns? Organisationally, how could you build a model of people who would commit that crime? What assets and skills would they need? And you know what I mean? All the way up to, well, those are probably who the people there. And it's the same pyramid, it's just turned the other way around. So breaking down the analysis process as a part of the intelligence process or the information process is really important. And none of that I've said there has talked anything about how we as law enforcement analysts would analyse data, the sort of thought processes and the skills and training that we would have in dealing with data, quant and qualitative analysis, bias, inference, logic, argument, all those kind of methodical processes. But most of law enforcement didn't care about those. Our customers just wanted a product that they could have confidence in. We might know all those things and study them, and you and I both have, and good analysts always do till the day they stop functioning. Otherwise, they're not current and relevant. A bit like training for sport, the moment you stop, you start losing capability or currency. But that's a kind of the practical position of analysis within law enforcement rather than purely what the analysts do. Does that move us forward a little bit?
Yeah, I think what I have to do is acknowledge that what you've done there is you've basically outlined, you've gone into intelligence analysis, you've then gone into kind of formal criminal intelligence analysis, and then you went into your model of criminal intelligence analysis that you developed and with the bits and pieces. And what you've demonstrated, I think, is something that I didn't really appreciate until much later in my career that I should have done, which is analysts outside of academia and business and public sector, sorry, we have far more scope because usually we are left to deal with situations because everything you said there was about multiple generation of hypotheses. It was about lots of different lines of inquiry. There was lots of what if this, then that, and then all the rest of it. There's so much scope there, so much kind of, and this is what I was alluding to at the start when I talked about in academia, analysis is usually a very singular piece of work on a singular piece of data. And it's what could those data points tell me about this one thing. Whereas, and I think we should explain to people who are not from a law enforcement background that not scientists, most analysts who are not ex-law enforcement or state security or military do not have that scope. Let's try and demonstrate that. So the reason why I'm not in the police anymore is because of essentially the financial crisis, change in policy, and unfortunately, the police got a lot smaller. And, a lot of the intelligence function had to go back in the early noughties, and that's just the way that it was. So I found myself looking for a job. Now, I thought that with all these intelligence analysis skills that I had, now it's true, I was very good at analysing situations and I was very good at kind of generating hypotheses and competing hypotheses and what if scenarios. Really, really good at that. And I thought, yeah, well, these are all transferable skills. I should be able to get a job somewhere else. And then I started looking at analytical jobs in the public sector and the private sector. And strangely, nothing in the role profiles or the CVs or the requirements matched any of the stuff that you've just been talking about or any of the stuff that I'd been doing. It was all qual, quant, performance reports, management information reports, essentially kind of statistical analysis or also some early forms of financial analysis. And it's because the rest of the world kind of went in a different direction because the rest of the world, and I know I've been picking on academics here, and I feel like at different parts in this episode, I feel like I've been walking a tightrope and I'm in danger of falling off into an abyss of annoying lots of people. I did have a slight superiority complex about intelligence analysis leaving the police because I thought of it as superior to the other forms of analysis out there. On reflection, I think the problem that you have is if we go back to my example of analysis can be different types of dance schools, if you like. The intelligence analysis school of dance gives its operatives so much scope and so many tools and free reign. You're almost like a private detective, except instead of a body, you've a situation. You've a situation where your bosses say to you, we need to know about X, go away and think about it. I don't care how you think about it. I don't care what processes or tools you do it, but as long as you can explain to me at the end the understanding you've come to and how you've got there, and as long as it makes sense to me, if I can go on that same journey as you, you've got free reign to do whatever you like. And there's blessings and curses with that. The blessing is you've got free reign to think what you like and explore what you like. But the curse is you've got the job of exploring every opportunity, every avenue to kind of think of everything and lift every stone and look underneath. And where I look down on my non-intelligence analyst colleagues who were in analytical roles was they were very formal and structured, and they were never given the scope or the opportunity. They were just basically told, here's some invoice data, some sales data, some other information, or in a public sector context, it's here's this metric about a certain performance measure, just collect it and just report on it in the following structure. Because it turns out policymaking, and I suppose this is the other big difference, and I'm on the second tightrope here, is in military and police intelligence analysis, not only do the analysts and intelligence have scope, but operationally, those agencies can do a lot of things, right? We can kick in doors, we can arrest people, we can put in surveillance devices, we can pay informants, we can go through bins, we can use satellites, we can do all sorts of stuff to try and increase our sense of what's going on. Our situational awareness is based on all these different assets. But you then try and transport that into a private sector organization or a public sector organization that's not police or military or security. They don't have access to any of those means of gathering intelligence. And even if they did have access to go through people's bins and satellites and tap phones and kick doors in, what could they do about it? Because with policy formation, usually if you're informing policy, policy is used as a guide for what you're going to do over the next year, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 50 years. In our old world, it's what are we going to do tomorrow, or sometimes even what should we do right now? So I think sometimes I used to think of it as a dichotomy between intelligence analysis and not intelligence analysis. But going back to your dictionary, I think that IA is a very broad school, and we will do a full episode on intelligence analysis later on. But I thought it's important here to kind of explain to people from a non-IA background that those distinctions between, because intelligence analysts get a lot of scope, they have access to a lot of kit, and the organizations they serve get to play around with stuff a lot more than the non-intelligence analysis agencies. And that's not to take anything away from those agencies. There's plenty of people in public life and in private companies who are making very important decisions based on data, and their analysis matters. Their interpretation of survey data matters. Their interpretation of quantitative data matters. It's just they don't get the opportunity to generate the type of hypotheses you're talking about, and even test them. So I think both sides can learn from each other. I think people from the intelligence analysis community can benefit from understanding how analysis works everywhere else in the rest of the world. Because here's the other big fly in the ointment with intelligence analysis, right? We all think IA is awesome, and we all think we've got the secret sauce. And we go into the world thinking, if the whole world could use this, right? But here's the thing. IA's been around a long time. It's been in the public sector a long time. It's taught at degree level now. It's not a secret. It's been around for decades. It's not taking over. It's not bedding in. City of London and all the financial sector are not jumping over intelligence analysts. Other sectors, big tech, aren't jumping over intelligence analysis. Now, there might be an argument whether they should. Maybe it's a missed opportunity or not. I'm not sure. But I think the problem with intelligence analysis is that there is so much tied up with the sector you're in, the organization you're in, and the problem you're trying to solve, that sometimes that doesn't translate well to the rest of the world. And what I'm hoping is maybe this can be the start of a conversation, or at least a catalyst for some further thought, so that people from the intel analysis world can think about how does it work in the rest of the world, and maybe the rest of the world can think about, well, actually, what am I missing? What could I do? Obviously within a legal framework and scope, but perhaps getting out of that dogmatic, structured, pigeonholed approach. And that's fully acknowledging that a lot of the time the analyst doesn't get to choose what data they collect, right? Or who collects it and how much they pay for it. But I think there's that interplay there. I think the most important thing for people to take away from this is intelligence analysis is a very different thing to non-intelligence analysis, and it's worth exploring that and being mindful about that. And the other thing is, both sides, when you swap from one to the other, and I've transferred both ways, it's tricky. It's hard because they're very different worlds. And I can talk to a fellow intelligence analyst from the police or the military or security services, and we talk a common language and we understand and get each other. I can try and explain these things to somebody who's from an analytical background outside of that, and I have no idea what I'm saying. And the reverse is true. So that's, I think, a challenge, and I think maybe an indicator that further work needs to be done analytically. Maybe we need firmer analytical standards. Maybe we need to kind of tighten this and bring these together, because we will touch on these in the full episodes, but I think IA's got problems, and I think the rest have got problems.
Kind of agree with you, but I actually think we are all birds of a feather. You were right to talk about law enforcement. Yes, on the plus side, we have the opportunity to intervene and act and collect data and information that maybe other sectors do not. But think about what the business goal of law enforcement is. It's to protect society from crime and criminality. So the risk of us getting it wrong is far bigger than some other areas. And I think you might see the same in medicine or in the military. I'm just picking two professions where the risk of failure is very high if you get it wrong. So in other organisations, the private sector, I would argue, and it's not that they're worse or better than us, they merely have a different business goal. Imagine if you were going to set up a fast food chain. If what you do results in success, you open more fast food outlets and you make more money. And that's the object of the business. If you fail, you may not have that business or go out of business, but nobody dies. Nobody suffers other than maybe losing their job, and I'm not, making that subordinate or minimising its impact, but it's very different to somebody losing their life through criminality or through war or through serious crime. Um, I like to look at other methods that other business processes use, and just for fun, before we were gonna look at this, I looked at one of many, and the internet is full of business experts or business platforms that will share with you how to do stuff for business. And I just pulled this one as symptomatic. How to analyse data if you're in business. Establish a goal. Determine the type of data analytics to use. Determine a plan to produce the data. Collect the data. Clean the data. Evaluate the data and visualise the data. Those are all processes that we use in law enforcement. But you're right. Do you notice that the end of their process of analysis is visualizing the data? It's not talking about generating an intelligence product and then communicating and having some kind of seat round the table with the decision makers, not to make the decision, but to help guide and advise them on what the data means. And for me, that's part of the private sector management structure, the business management structure tends to be where senior managers, and you could argue the same in politics, particularly these days when you look at the global trend towards personality politics rather than collaborative politics, or this tribal infighting between parties rather than people thinking I'll do what's right for my constituents and the nation as a whole, which is what their role is supposed to be. The decision making is done far more at those higher levels. And if I've done this many times, I've gone to leadership conventions and spoke to them as an outsider. I love being the outsider because it challenges me, and I hope it challenges them and makes them think differently. And they'll say to me, "Well, we don't need an analyst to drive the decision making. Just give us the data and we'll interpret it." And I've got loads of scenarios where business failures, where these senior managers and their arrogance, and I mean intellectual arrogance, I don't mean the necessarily arrogant people, but their business process is arrogant and it thinks that only that group of employees within the organisation has an influence on decisions. And I would take them back through their processes, even where their analysts were only doing what I would call the lower level analysis, not the higher level, and say, well, look, even though you're making the decision, you're taking more of the process over in your own heads as senior managers, you're still relying on the information from those people beneath you, the collection, the collation, the visualization and everything else. So if they get that wrong, your decision making is still going to be flawed, even if your processes that you use when it gets to you are right, because you're working with a flawed product. So for me, it's a broad church, and I've grown in my abilities and my flexibility, and I would hope my professional skills as an analyst, by working in those kind of challenging circumstances, just like you going from the police to the private sector. I'll give you one really good example back within law enforcement. The professional bodies in law enforcement to support analysis started back in the 80s and through the 90s and the 2000s. They kind of went on this journey of becoming important and influential. And then kind of like when law enforcement couldn't afford intelligence and analysis and maybe decided there were other better processes, maybe we don't need all that, we can work it out for ourselves, almost a migration to the private sector business model. And I have my own thoughts on that, but I would say that's my view of the reality globally. The profession has had a process and it reached a high point and it's maybe stepped back in influence, and maybe it'll come again, I don't know. That's just the culture of the business. There were two particular professional bodies, formed like most in America initially, and therefore having a heavy North American influence on their structure, even though they were called international. And one was a body that included in its name an association of crime analysts, and was an association of intelligence analysts. And in Australia, there was one that had in its title intelligence officers. And I can remember, I was a member of all of these, and I actually served in various roles in each of them just to make make my contribution to the profession, and ended up being very high in one in particular. And I then left them all because I realised they were flawed, and from an ethics and integrity process, they created me process problems as a law enforcement officer. I had to maintain an ethical standard that they struggled to. That's just me. But I can remember sitting down with two that were very competitive, the intelligence analysts and the crime analysts. They'd say, no, we're crime analysts, so we're the best. We're the ones who are best informed. And the intelligence analysts would say, no, we're the best. And I said, well, why are either of you the best? You're both working in law enforcement. You both are dealing with the same problem. You, the crime analysts, would argue that you are dealing with crime data. What's a crime report? It's a piece of paper or an electronic record which is a summary collected from a human being contacting law enforcement to say, I've had my house burgled, some kind of criminal event. Somebody else in law enforcement collecting that, an attending officer or somebody on a telephone. Maybe scenes of crime officers or specialists going to the scene and examining it. Analysts don't by and large go to the scenes of crime, so they can't collect data firsthand. So the crime analysts are dealing with purely crime information. But when you talk to them, they said, well, actually, no, we do get information from informants and from other officers. I said, well, so you're information analysts? Well, yeah. Right. I went to my intelligence analyst colleagues. Where do you start with? Well, we'll deal with intelligence, not just crime. I says, yes, I agree with you. But we've already established that the crime analysts are already dealing with all those products. You're dealing with all those products, including crime data. What's the difference? And you could see them thinking, and there was a lot of resistance to it. Well, you don't understand. I said, well, I'm trying to, and I'm not being provocative. I'm genuinely trying to understand. Am I missing something in what you do? Because from first principles, I don't see the difference. It may be your organisation requires a different product, but that's nothing to do with your skill set particularly, your sort of generic professional training and experience and what you bring to the table as an employee. And finally, they had to agree. And although many of those organisations have kept going on their own because they have a business need as an organisation to have power and influence, not necessarily merit, some have come together and grown. That's kind of why I've stepped back from them all, because there's not one of them that represents my perspective. You'd never see a business analyst around any of those professional bodies. I've worked with professional bodies for business and for management and for leadership for years, and I've worked with the private sector building databases and data sets and computers. I wouldn't know the first thing about those things, but I understand how users of those products, and therefore it's important you understand how the IT people build these machines, because they don't always do and give you what you think they're giving you. And it's just this idea of picking apart. So, yes, there are differences in terms of what maybe the training, the culture, the life journey, the professional journey of the individual analysts are within these organisations. But stick them all in a room and actually get them to take the blinkers off and think about first principles rather than their particular definitions, like analysis. What is analysis? And I've never found a situation where those who were real analysts, i.e. open to looking at methodology and studying it and picking it apart and challenging themselves, I've never had a situation where they didn't see that they got more in common than they did that divided them, even though their clients, their senior managers and their organisations may have different business requirements of them. And maybe that's not a bad situation to be in, because going forwards, having that perspective, that ability to be a student of all things rather than a master of one, jack of all trades rather than master of one, that's where analysis will come back to the table as a function, which is still here, but as a profession worthy of credit, where it starts to build and blend all of these things, particularly in these days of globalisation, of organisations, of data sets. If you took away every profession in the term analyst and the term analysis, and we're just human beings walking around, every single human being is an analyst. You're analysing data all day and every day, but it's subjective and individual for interpret data in the real world and live as part of your survival and, your quality of life. So I think we've put a lot of models in that you would hope would be designed to help us think and improve those processes for analysis, but sometimes they actually divide and create barriers, artificial barriers to us exploring what analysis really could be and therefore the opportunities it can provide.
I'm gonna gently push back. I know most of the time we agree, but I think and maybe I've misled you in what I
You
said
push away, mate.
previously.
You know,
Um,
that's why we have these conversations.
so I don't think I've articulated properly what the tension is that I'm trying to refer to, because obviously I'm now 12 years in public sector, but outside of public sector, I've done some private sector work as well. And I've observed a difference, and I'm going to struggle to articulate it, but this is, I've talked about tightropes. I'm now going to get my BMX and try and go along this tightrope because I am going to fall off, but I'll give it my best shot. I think analysts, when you really boil down to what are the skill sets that analysts have and what are they recruiting for on the job sites, right? If you're leaving uni right now or you're career change, you're looking for jobs right now, I would argue that there's some fundamental differences between the intelligence analyst brigade, and they may come from North America, law enforcement, military, state security, whatever. And yes, you're right. A lot of them have far more in common than they have separate, but we all, as human beings, we like to pigeonhole ourselves and form factions and walls for all sorts of reasons that are nothing to do with getting the job done. We just like to specialize, right? And we like to kind of professionalize things and perhaps, it's more about career opportunity than actual furthering the method, shall we say. But I'll leave that to one side. The analysts that I've worked with and trained outside of the IA community, the ones that work in public sector or private sector, I'm going to try and explain by example. Okay. So if I go to a public sector analyst and say, here's a survey, and let's say it's a survey about, I'm going to pick something at random, customer satisfaction of the local swimming baths. Okay. So it's a survey. And I want you to imagine this survey has got 100 respondents. The public sector analyst and probably even the private sector analyst will say, well, I'll look at the survey and I'll analyze that survey, and using principles which are probably academically rooted, whether they know it or not, but they'll essentially come up with patterns and trends, right? They'll say X% were happy with this, and it's broadly positive, it's broadly negative, and the following, they'll codify the comments and say, a third of people mentioned the restaurant, a third of people mentioned the opening times, and they would cherry pick these things, but it would be based on basically the consensus in the data that they're looking at. Because consensus is evidence, and that evidence will go either in a report, and that report will go up through the management chain, potentially up to C-suite or maybe somewhere middle management. But essentially, the product they create is about the weight of the evidence. More people than not say the swimming baths are good and that they like the restaurant. Secondly, there's a technical component to it. A lot of organizations use the word analyst in the title when they want you to jump over a number of technical hurdles. They want you to be the interface between the cutting edge tech and the problems the organization faces. So what I'm getting at is a private and public sector lot will get this survey. They'll be very technically well trained, and they will go cognitively for a scientific approach, if you like. We're saying the consensus is X. And then when I sit down and say, well, did you know in a law enforcement context or in a military or state security context, we'd take that survey of 100 respondents and we would analyze every single claim as a potential hypothetical scenario, because it could be possible that there's some horrendous standards in that swimming baths, and it could be that you've got the completely wrong sample. Maybe the people giving the surveys out were giving out free chocolate bars and milkshakes. Maybe you surveyed the people on a Monday morning after the cleaners had been in, but you didn't survey anybody on the Friday, and that's why nobody goes, because it's in a right state. We have to analyze every single possible scenario, and we have to analyze every single possible truth claim from every single respondent. And I've had people say to me, well, that'd be, you'd go mad. You can't factor in all that type of stuff. And that's so much speculation. I can't feed that to my management. I can't put that in a report. I can't say there's a possibility that, I can't question the way it was collected. I can't question the structure. And so that's what I was trying to allude to when I said that when sometimes in the public and private sectors, people in analytical roles are confined by the data they can collect, because everything has a cost, right? So their collection methods are limited. The scope of what they can put in their reports is limited. And what I would also say is, and I think this is a as a result of, and not in a bad way, it's not deliberate, I just think it's an unfortunate outcome. I think when you try to be robust and scientific in a public sector context that's not intelligence analysis, you try and remove as much of yourself out of the analysis. You want the scientific process, a bit like you're back at school and you're doing the experiment. You want to say, look, I ran this data through this process. I came up with this pattern that 40% of people thought X. And if anybody else went through this process, they would come to the same conclusion. And here you go. It's in a report, move on. Whereas in the intelligence analysis, you know as well as I, you can give intelligence analysts the same data points, exactly the same data points, and they can generate hypotheses and ideas that are completely different and equally as valid and worthy of consideration. And that's the tension. And if I was being critical of IA before, it wasn't. I didn't mean to be. What I meant was the reason why I don't think IA hasn't got into because I'll now go for a wheelie on the tightrope. I can't stand data science. Okay, I'm going to nail my close to the mast. I think it's a horrible term. I don't think it's very scientific. I think it's essentially, at best, it's a shopping bag with some existing known concepts inside it. And yeah, I love machine learning. Yes, I love professional judgment. And yes, I love working with tech and data. And I love statistics. Those are all amazing things, but we've had those things for a long, long, long time. To put them in a Gucci bag and call it data science, yeah, it works. It sells stuff. It sounds new, but we've been here before, right? We've been here with big data, data mining, business intel. The commodification of information work has been going on for decades, and this is just the latest. And we're starting to see it now. I've stayed out of the data science argument because I had, and maybe I'm going to be proven wrong. But the term specifically data science, I don't think has got long left. At least, well, maybe I just hope not, because I will hope that the underlying principles get some attention. That's a topic for a different pod. I'll come back onto the main topic. But does that make sense on where I'm getting at with the IA analysts versus all the other analysts, and how that interpretation of survey data is an example of how we might go in very different directions?
It makes complete sense, and I agree with everything you've said, but I still semantically and philosophically don't see a massive difference. Let me explain. Yes, they have very little say in the data set they're given. I and you have been in situations in law enforcement when the task has been, that's all the data we've got, and we haven't time to go into doing full analysis and exploratory collection of other data and all the issues that you'd look at. We want what you might almost call a quick and dirty product. So we'd turn out what, for me, wasn't really an analytic product, and we're using terms here, and I'm very conscious of terms. It was an information product. We'd taken data, we'd processed it, and we came up with information, and other people would then use that to form decision making. It wasn't the intelligence product that we were trained to do. So we're kind of half doing the job. Go to the private sector, completely get that. If that's all they do every day, and those are the constraints, there's no problem that, because that's what the business organisation requires of them. But I would hope in their tool set and their ability to plan and be flexible for the future, and business, like everything in life, has to be flexible or it will die. It will go through a cycle and be overtaken by more efficient and new business models. Those analysts, are part of their personal and professional development in their role, and maybe the organisations as well, may think, well, we need to have a bit of blue sky thinking here, scan the event horizon. What are the other methodologies, like law enforcement, the military, or whatever, that might teach us something that, even though it doesn't fit our business model right now, what if there is a point where we need our analysts who are functioning as information generators, the product of manipulating and collating data to feed to managers, decision makers? What if we find a point where we want something more from them? Maybe they change the management structure, or the way that the decisions are made in the business. Maybe they have, all businesses that survive have somebody looking at data sets outside their normal organizational data, because if they don't, they die because they didn't know. And The example that you gave, customer feedback or client feedback, that's great, and you can collect and use qual and quant data analysis tools that are scientifically, academically proven and tested over the years. They have statistical and all the rest of significance you want to put to it. They pass that QA test in terms of a data set. But if the survey asked the wrong questions that they were designed to try and give understanding about, or they asked the wrong people, or were at the wrong time, or collected in the wrong form, or any of the data identification and processing issues to generate information, the information product's not going to take them where they want. They're going to act based on false information. Like you say, the survey showed that 80% of people are highly satisfied with the baths, the swimming baths. Well, where does that take us in the business? Well, if you're a business that's running swimming baths, it might give you a comfort zone, and then when somebody dies in the baths because the data, the customers that you surveyed weren't aware of key process issues in the business model that might lead to risk, you're in trouble as a business, as an organisation. Or somebody comes in from the outside and says, well, it's all right, is all of this. The customers might be really happy, but are they getting the most efficient service for what they want, which is to go somewhere and have a swim? Because if they aren't, another business provider of swimming opportunities who's been a bit more aware of what the trends are and the opportunities in the marketplace because they've looked at other forms of data, might come in and find an opportunity and take your customers away from you. So for me, it's almost a natural selection. Law enforcement's the same, although and the military are the same. The processes might be a bit more evolved, but the risks are far higher. But we're still in a business model of survival because successful intel analysis within military structures, hopefully is part of the team of decisions and responses and resource allocation that result in success, i.e. we win the war, or we're able to defend, or we minimise our losses, or we're able to sustain the logistics of supply of training and recruiting soldiers, of managing them effectively in the field, of providing the weaponry that they need, of managing the many other stakeholders in it, the public, the victims, the other nations, the politicians. You know what I mean? Move it into law enforcement, same thing. Well, if we get it wrong, we are going to, in our customer surveys, as well as the many layers of quality assurance that are applied to law enforcement globally, usually, we're going to get found out. We are going to be blamed for when we get it wrong because there'll be a spike in crime, or there'll be a disaster or a risk that we've not minimised or even identified. Look at all the academic and professional literature for the law enforcement and the military is littered with the best learning examples of all in life are situations where hindsight shows that they failed. Success you don't always notice because it's just an every day, but failure you notice because in our world and the military worlds or the medical worlds, the consequences of failure are far higher than, in many ways, than the private sector, and I've already discussed that. So do you see where I'm coming from?
Yeah.
Maybe that
depends on the perspective when you say
Yeah.
that it's higher, because it's from a financial cost. But I think this is at the crux of it, mate, is that the problem is that I would say intelligence analysts deal in almost Hail Mary insights, which can be afforded in a military or law enforcement context, because sometimes that's the only way you detect the crime, it's the only way you would do the intervention. A lot of businesses can't afford that level of high risk, high return. They want low risk, standard return. Because what I'm saying is, if I'm a director of a company, if I have two choices, okay, and let's say I've got a set budget, I've got, I don't know, 50K, right? And I've got 50K on the table, and I can hire a former intelligence analyst and hopefully just retrain them in my business area and get them to do all that kind of blue sky thinking, all the hypothesis generation, all the stuff you spoke about. And I do think that's got value. In my heart, I'll always be an intelligence analyst, and I do think it's got value. And I actually think when AI starts to take over a little bit more, I think you'll see IA. I think intelligence analysts might drive some of the large language models in new and interesting ways, but that's a separate topic. But from a risk point of view, I can hire somebody who's technical and has a statistical background, and I'll be honest, mate, probably do it cheaper, and I can take less of a risk and get more of a standard, less of a Hail Mary insight, but more of just a kind of a regular routine insight, and I've got somebody techie, I've got somebody who's stats wise, and you know what? I will let my managers and I'll let my executives do the thinking, because I think at this heart of this, and again, stealing from thunder from another episode, but you and I both know where IA came from, and very, very long story short, we have a certain individual who tried to professionalize intelligence analysis because I saw the tension between military officers and civil servants, and tried to kind of standardize how information should be collected and analyzed. And that was the birth of the profession. The guy was called Sherman Kent, and again, we'll talk about him later, but essentially, he led the way for the professionalization of the discipline of intelligence analysis. But he also led the way for the creation of it as a specialism. What I'm saying is, I've not yet seen much market demand outside of those sectors for that skill set. I'm not saying it's not needed. I think it would be. I just think that IA is expensive, high risk, and if you buy a okay, I'll choose my words carefully here. If you hire a average data stroke stats analyst, the output's probably going to be okay, because you can test the statistical methodology, you can test the technology, you can do that. If I hired an intelligence analyst, and even if they're the best analyst in their previous sector, there is a risk that they won't generate any insights for me. They may descend into mysticism, they may generate lots of hypotheses, but when I'm doing my quarterly return or my annual return, I'm trying to work out how much money, how much profit have you generated, or how much money have you saved me? Or if in a public sector context, you know, you can never put in a white paper or a government report that here's the 20 different hypotheses and in ranked order. It's just not going to happen. So, but don't get me wrong, mate. I'm not saying one is better than the other. I'm not saying that one should replace the other. I'm saying that in the whole area of analysis, we should recognize the scope and limits of who's being asked to do what and what skill sets and what background. And yeah, we have far more in common than we have that separates us, but there are some gulfs there that need to be managed, I think.
Agree with that, but think, and again, I'm looking to the private sector. Think about the sea changes or the sudden changes of direction of business models in commerce. And I'm thinking back to, obviously, we're both British, so we have the history of the UK being this nation that had ships and built trading networks around the world. The change of business model, we had the Industrial Revolution. Suddenly we've gone from the horse and plough to steam engines doing the work of many horses and many ploughs, a bit like the golem. It's just those opportunities, the businesses that identified them and took those risks early on, and yes, they would have to invest in resources, and the risk was maybe they may not return on those investments. But that's life. You take a risk in everything you do. That's a business decision. It's kind of like betting. Do you go for the safe odds or do you bet on the horse that's got really little chance of winning, kind of the national lottery, and you bet on them to win, not to place or show? It's bigger risk, bigger reward. But the businesses that took those risks, and I'm sure there were millions that tried and failed, the ones that did and succeeded changed the face of business. The Industrial Revolution changed the whole of the UK in terms of its commercial model, its business model, the way it employed people, the way it had management structures and staff, the logistical and business structures that it had, involvement in politics, involvement in international collaboration that continues to this day. And I am sure that the arrival of AI, large language models, like the arrival of the internet, the arrival of mobile devices or even computers, from the days when you'd do it with a calculator, and I mean a mechanical calculator, a slide rule or logarithmic tables. I can do qual and quant analysis. I don't particularly enjoy it, but I can do it as a function. I'm trained to do it. And within my academic field, I'm always looking at my students coming up with academic products and assessing them based on that and in my research. It's not something I particularly enjoy, but it's a discipline. and it's a value in the right circumstance applied properly. But those spikes, like you say, most businesses don't want to invest. I understand that. But in this world more than ever any other, where the business opportunity for outliers to become involved in your business area from anywhere in the world and any group of society or class of people or maybe a cultural group, you've only got to look at the internet, where if I wanted to make a point and walked out in the street and started shouting the earth is flat, my audience is those people who can hear me, who happen to be outside my house and within hearing distance. I can post something on a global social media platform saying the world is flat, very little effort, and I reach millions and millions of people. That's a business opportunity for influence. Hence, we've got these terms of these people who follow it, who have no scientific training or no business training. They are influencers. They're just people who are using those platforms. And I'm not decrying them, but they're often very successful in business because they're exploiting those new opportunities better than others, certainly better than most business organisations, because they tend to be legacy institutions that have a history. And a bit, I always liken it to the Titanic versus little agile speedboats. The Titanic's this massive ship carrying loads of people. To change direction, the decision path from the captain down to the guy with the wheel and the guy in the engine room, or lady, to turn the wheel can take a long time. And then when you turn it, you may have put the turning instruction into the rudder, but it might be several miles before this big behemoth turns and eventually hits the iceberg, even though your desire was to turn. A speedboat can nip in and out and be far more flexible. That's kind of where we are with individuals versus organisations. And maybe analysis and the practitioners of analysis, regardless of their professional role or the organisational requirements of them, need to have the ability to be, at the same time, to pick out of their toolbox the ability to be part of the team on the Titanic or the captain of the speedboat that's just got them in and, nothing else. Does that kind of make sense?
I agree with you. And I think ultimately it boils down to what we're dancing around is analysis is thought. And we're talking about who pays people to think and what do they pay them to think about. And I think if organizations wish to analyze traditional data using traditional methods and traditional technology, they will yield traditional outcomes. If they wish to seek unorthodox ways of thinking and producing insight, then I think it's not guaranteed, but they will get non-traditional outcomes, positive and negative. And to be honest with you, I think the other thing we're dancing around is I think we're getting mixed up and probably talking past each other, because I am not saying, I think we're talking about the analysis itself, and the analyst, the role, because lots of executives and lots of managers perform those analytical functions right now. They may do it informally, but they perform that function. And so I think, not for today, because we're reaching the end, but perhaps for another episode, maybe we'll think about the best case for the analyst as a separate and distinct role to analysis the function, and whether even do we still need the analyst. And that's not because of ChatGPT or anything. I just mean in a future where we have better access to data and the more crude forms of analysis, can we just get by with our executives and our managers and our core personnel? Or is there a benefit in having a dedicated person called the analyst, maybe a professional naysayer or cynic or friendly adversary inside the organization? But that's a topic for another day. So I'm going to bring it to a close there. Is there anything else you want to close out with?
Yeah, one final point. I've been very lucky in my career, both through law enforcement and since, to work with a massive number of different agencies and organisations and individuals, and people with different roles in organisations, through public, private sector, globally. And I've always enjoyed collaboration, because that it does create stress and challenge. That's part of what we call transformational change. These things butt against each other, but then sometimes in that butting and initial problems and stress, what comes out of it is of greater benefit. I have worked on collaborative projects all my life. I've done it within law enforcement, but the most productive projects, given time, I have to say, and this is with me and with my law enforcement background, certainly the private sector would be, when I go and lecture to the private sector, they view me as the ex-law enforcement investigator or intelligence analyst. Even though I'm qualified in their fields as well, I've taken the trouble to be courteous to them and try and get my head around what they do, as well as try and introduce them to what I do or did in my career. I've always had greater success with public-private sector collaboration, where if I'd done it with purely just law enforcement or just private sector. And that's the point. These organisations are all part of one big society. Like the analyst is just one person, or the analysis function is one function in a business model of an organisation. Society doesn't run because there is law enforcement out there. It doesn't run because there's policing business out there, supply and demand, or transport networks, or medical networks, or gas, or weather control, or politics, blah, blah, blah. It runs as a group of individuals who operate individually and in groups, and we're all in different groups, professional groups, private groups, family groups, all the rest of it, relationship groups. But all those functions have to work alongside each other. And the more we can do within our professional roles to try and build those bridges and acknowledge the differences and look for opportunities for collaboration, the better the outcome, both for society, individuals, for the customers and clients of these organisations, and for the organisations themselves. I was trained in something called disaster victim identification, and basically it's a process in the UK, but it's global, where, say there's a natural disaster. It might be a terrorist attack, but it might also be an earthquake or whatever. So suddenly there's an unforeseen event that requires support from organisations, a flood or an earthquake or a lightning strike or hunger. You fly in teams. I would go in with law enforcement, and part of law enforcement's function is not only to control the situation from a disorder point of view, but investigate any criminal activity, but also support our medical colleagues in terms of who are these people who've died or been injured, identifying them, that kind of process. So bagging bodies with forensic colleagues, labelling them so ultimately we can figure out who died, who their families are so that they're notified, and any kind of process like that, you're trying to return the actual situation in the environment to the norm. So you're trying to fix something that broke through this disaster. But we were just one group in that. There would be local authorities, charities, community groups, community individuals, fire, rescue, the military. The society would come together. And the role of the police in the models that we used, and they replicate what many of the major nations use around the world, is to act not only to do their bit of the pie chart, their law enforcement function, if you want to call it that, but also to act as the kind of round table creators and managers to bring these people to the round table to say, well, this is my task with my law enforcement hat on. What's your task from a local government task? What's your task from a military task? What's your task from a health task? What's your task from a community representative task? And again, like in my training, that practical experience was the only way to resolve that problem and come out with a success for everybody, or the least possible negative impact for everybody, to minimise the impact. Does that make sense? And I know it sounds very highfalutin and aspirational, but these are real practical things I've done, and that's what's given me my view on life and on the idea of analysis and these divisions, to say we need to be above that if we're going to forget organisations and roles as human beings collaborating with each other. If we think like that, analysis should be collaborative to some point, regardless of the organisational requirements and our backgrounds, because life is collaborative.
I think we're in violent agreement with each other, mate. So yeah, I think we'll probably call it there.
Yep,
So thank you for today.
I enjoyed that.
Yeah, me too.